I spent 1 full year memorizing how to play perfect GTO on the flop. These are the actual flashcards that I spent hundreds of hours of my life memorizing. But I did not improve. I was able to play fantastic Nash on the flop, but I was still stuck playing the same low stakes. I was missing a key piece of flop strategy. If I had known this earlier, I would have saved a year of my life. I'm going to share it with you guys today, and it's definitely not what you think. Without further ado, I just want to get right into it because this is the video that is going to help you crush those stakes. Every single opponent is exploitable. Linislav, Stefan, Marinelli. These guys are the best of the best, but they also make mistakes. They know this. But oftentimes, we're afraid to capitalize on our opponent's mistakes because we fear that they will adjust versus our strategy and then beat us in return. I'll tell you why we really should not worry about this too much in just one moment, but first I want to make the following proposition. I propose that the level to which we should exploit our opponent depends on our opponent's ability to react. This summarizes a concept I like to call level of exploitation, and we'll stick with it for the entire duration of the video. Following the logic of this statement, clearly we should aim to exploit weak opponents as much as possible and exploit strong opponents minimally. It seems simple until you consider one key point, and understanding that key point changed the way that I play poker forever. I never want to leave you guys hanging, so I'm just going to tell you it right now. There is a natural limit to how much our opponents are able to react versus exploitative strategies. Even the very best players in the world, the ones who know how to react perfectly versus an exploit, in some cases will never be able to counter-exploit some of our exploits. This is a big deal. It proves that we don't have to worry a lot about being countered, and we can sometimes play in very outrageous ways without our opponent ever being able to react. And so to rephrase my initial statement, the level to which we should exploit our opponent depends on our opponent's ability to react, but we never have to worry about playing perfectly balanced. In order to prove this to you, I'd like to present the following example. So let's suppose that we're playing against a top level reg. We open from the small blind and big blind calls. The flop comes 8, 7, 4 flush draw. If we click over to the ranges tab, we will see that our opponent, big blind, has a lot more straights, has more sets, and has more 2-pair in their range. They also have a few more draws, and they're playing in position, which gives them a fairly large advantage on this texture. And so because of big blind's big advantage here, we have to do a lot of checking when playing a small blind. But let's suppose we knew that our very skilled opponent had a very specific leak. When we bet pocket eights, we think they'll call us, and when we check, we think they'll check a little bit too often. Because of this, we might want to bet pocket eights, but clearly it would be a very big mistake to always bet our strongest hands versus a very, very good opponent. Correct? No. A lot of people will not realize this, but we can actually just bet all of our strongest hands here and check a super weak range, no matter how skilled of a player big blind is. This is due to the natural limit of how much our opponent is able to punish us for playing so imbalanced. Let's see why. Using GTO Wizard AI, I node-locked small blind strategy to always bet with 2-pair, sets, and straights. The solver tells us we're making a massive mistake by doing this, but honestly, I don't really trust computers. The main danger of betting all of these strong hands on the flop is that we check back a very unprotected and weak range. So to understand if what we're doing is wrong or not, we need to take a look at big blind's optimal response when we check. And so here it is. On the right, we can see what big blind's initial strategy looks like when small blind decides to check. They're betting around half the time here, only ever using a medium bet size. However, as shown on the left, when small blind checks capped, big blind strategy looks very different. You can see that they're betting more often, but most importantly, they are now using a larger bet size because their stronger hands have more equity. Without going into a long explanation of why, I want to stress that our opponents must increase their bet size to effectively exploit us when we check capped. This larger size allows them to bluff more, and it puts a lot of pressure on our marginal holdings, which greatly decreases the EV of our strategy. Good players will know to do this, as will our expert opponent, and so this looks really bad for us. That is, of course, until we consider 2 points. Point number 1, noticing we're imbalanced is hard. We've only increased our betting frequency by around 3% compared to the original sim. This is a very small change, and so as long as we're playing reasonably well and not being too obvious with what we're doing elsewhere, it's just going to take our opponent tens of hours to differentiate our strategy from noise and figure out that we're checking capped. There's a lot of variance in poker, which makes it reasonably easy for us to disguise small to moderate strategic changes like this one. Point number 2, we can always react quicker. What do you guys think is more obvious? For our opponent to notice that we're betting a little bit more often on the flop, or for us to notice our opponent has started to bet bigger? Of course it's the latter. Our opponent needs to spend tens of hours to figure out what we're doing, but we only need to see one hand versus our opponent in order to understand exactly what they are now doing in return. But there's an asymmetry here. We will always be able to adjust quicker versus our opponent. We see them bet big, now we flip the switch, start checking our strong hands, and print rent money until our opponent once again spends tens of hours to realize what we're doing. We never have to play perfectly balanced, and there's a good reason for it that goes beyond the simple, our opponents can never play perfect Nash. If I had known this earlier, I would not have spent hundreds of hours trying to memorize complicated instructions to play perfect Nash on the flop. I tried to do this because I wanted to prepare myself to play versus really good players, but I just didn't know that I was actually preparing myself to make less money than I could. Today, I prioritize playing exploitatively first, and I have to admit, just playing and not being afraid to try crazy new strategies on the flop has been a lot more fun, and it's taught me a lot about how people play poker, which helped me develop skills I needed to develop flop strategies that actually work. Let's go through some of these together. We're going to examine some exploitative flop strategies versus different opponent types based on their playstyle and ability to react. Let's get started by looking at how we would play versus a very weak new player. This is going to be a player type that you will face at every stake and every game in the world. Suppose that we have the opportunity to open from the small blind, and we know that big blind is a newer, weaker opponent who will frequently call our bets but rarely place any of their own. This player type is really common at all the stakes. Versus this opponent, I would open a lot wider than what the sim is showing me here, but if we do open and get called, and the flop comes 8, 7, 4 flush draw, I'd want to play a flop strategy that looks something like this. Apart from having a much wider pre-flop opening range, this is exactly how I would play the flop versus a very weak passive fish. Notice that I'm always betting with my strong hands and almost never bluffing because I don't expect my opponent to fold. Checking our strong hands here would be a mistake because our opponent will never build a pot for us. We're also betting our nut flush draws because we dominate a big part of their calling range, as well as our best combo draws because they have a very high chance of improving to a strong hand and getting called in a big pot. If our opponent really doesn't like to fold, we can even start betting our weaker pairs as well as our strongest ace highs. Compared to the Nash solution on the right, we're betting way too often and are checking an incredibly weak range. But remember, because this opponent is unlikely to even notice what we're doing, we can get away with this and a lot more. In fact, versus this player type, on any board in any formation, I would just recommend donking the flop with value, even playing multi-way if they're really stationy. There's just way too much money to be made by betting strong hands, and so there's no real reason to check. Spewy Recs can be thought of as cash drops. I could be playing versus all the top players in the world, and they could understand how I play on every single street, and I'd still make money at the table if there's a Spewy recreational to my right. In fact, I'd be swimming in money if they're able to keep playing for a while. We all know this player type. They love betting and hate folding. When we're in position, it's very easy to play against them because all we ever have to do is just bet our decent hands and check everything else. But when we're playing out of position, say for example on 8-7-4 flush draw, our strategy changes a bit. Versus a Spewy fish, I'd actually recommend playing something like this. Notice that we're now checking all of our strong hands with the intention to raise our opponent after they bet. This builds the pot a lot faster because we get an extra street of value in when we raise on the flop. Instead, I'd like to place a very small bet, the smallest bet possible, with all of my hands that prefer to keep the pot small. This includes flush draws, weak pairs, etc. This is a form of pot control, and it's very important to do this because we deny our opponent the ability to then place a bet when we check. Again, it's okay even doing this as a donk bet because they will never adjust when they don't even know what a donk bet is. If our opponent likes raising these small bets though, we're just better off always checking. Here, it's really important to understand our opponent, but as long as we're okay at poker and willing to get a little bit experimental and creative, we should be making tons of money versus this player type. Okay, so now that we've covered the fish, let's learn about how to exploit regs, both weak and strong. I sorted regs into two main categories, passive and aggressive. We'll talk first about how to play versus weaker regs, and then I'll share how to play versus each profile as their skill level improves. First, we're going to assume that we're playing against a weaker, passive reg who still understands the fundamentals of poker quite well. You might find many of these players at the lower stakes. They don't bet rivers often, and they typically fold too much on each street. Going back to 8-7-4 flush draw, I'd play something like this. The first thing you should notice is that I'm bluffing way too much. I'm betting all of my draws here as well as many of my backdoor flush draws. To balance this out, I'm betting a lot of my top pairs as well as my over pairs to always keep them wondering if I'm bluffing or not. However, because I think they fold too much, I'd much rather check raise my strongest hands. I'm also check calling a fair bit of my top pairs because I really do expect them to pick up on weakness when I show it in a very obvious way. When I play like this versus a reg, I expect them to feel that something's off. Likely, they'll probably get this feeling that I'm out of line, and they might even stomach their anxiety and start calling me a bit more on the turn and on the river. When they start doing this, I just have to stop bluffing as much on the flop, start betting bigger with my strong hands, and then when they do stop calling, I just go back to my default strategy of bluffing a ton. My level of exploitation is quite high versus this player type because I don't believe that they know how to adjust properly versus my strategy. As you gain more and more experience versus these players, you'll quickly become better and better at picking up their very obvious tendencies. There's a lot of really good players, even at the lower stakes, who I'd still classify as passive regs. These players are fundamentally great at poker, but their strategy is never really focused around heavily exploiting anyone. I call them passive because they'll typically react to you by either bluffing a little bit more or just overcalling. They'll rarely take heavily aggressive actions on their own. You'll almost never face massive overbets versus them, and they're usually not very comfortable massively overbluffing their range in seemingly tame spots. Because these guys are a lot better at poker, we have to tone down our level of exploitation. Now it's important for us to really conceal our strategy and not look too out of line. My flop strategy on 8-7-4 flush draw versus a good but passive reg looks something like this. You can see that we're still bluffing a fair bit, but definitely not as much as we would versus a weaker reg. On the flop, I'm mainly going to be bluffing with my strongest draws, and to keep my frequency mostly in line, I'll be checking many of my air hands. I'd still bet a few of them just to look tricky, especially if we have to adjust later on, but most of my weaker hands would much rather check to instead bluff on the turn or on the river. Because I expect this player type to call close to the right amount, and I don't think that they'll be putting a lot of pressure on me when I check, I'd much rather bet a lot of my strong hands, like my strongest top pair, and many of my over pairs. Again, there's nuance here, so I might decide to check my strongest hands versus specific opponents who I think bet a bit too much when I check. But the main strategy here, just like versus the weaker reg, is to bluff a lot. Now that we've talked about battling the passive reg, it's time to get to the real fun stuff. We're going to learn how to play versus the aggressive reg. Nowadays, especially with the rise of all the different poker stables, it's really common to face poker players who will frequently try to push you out of the pot by bluffing and betting big whenever they get the chance to do so. These red line players can be really difficult to face, especially when you don't know what you're doing, in part because our brains aren't really wired to feel good when calling and losing more than half the time, even though that's usually how it works in poker. However, once you do know how to exploit them, it feels really rewarding to stand your ground and show them that you will not be steamrolled over. At the lower stakes, aggressive players often lack the nuance in their strategy necessary to prevent us from heavily exploiting them. So, just like when we face the weak passive reg, our level of exploitation can be quite high. Playing versus a weaker aggressive reg, my flop strategy on 8-7-4 flush draw would look very simple. I'd always check. There's no reason for us to bet any of our strong hands, because they're probably going to overstab when we check, giving us an opportunity to check raise, and there's no reason to bet any weak hands because they might call too much or raise too much. In fact, because we're facing so much aggression post-flop, I'd actually start by exploiting my opponent pre-flop by choosing to open a little bit tighter. I would exclude hands like Jack 2 suited, Jack 4 suited, and a lot of these 8x offsuit hands. On other flops though, like King 5-4 rainbow, we can't always check. Our natural betting frequency here is so high, it's over 30%, that if we always checked, it would be really obvious to our opponent, what we're doing. Here, we have to go with a different strategy. Here, we can get a pretty decent betting frequency by just betting all of our strong hands that are not quite good enough to check raise with. We can also consider betting a lot of our marginal hands as well as our draws, because although these hands are not super happy getting called and raised too much, they're also not super happy checking because our opponent is going to frequently overstep. Good aggressive players are probably some of the most difficult players to be up against when playing poker. These players are relentless, and I can definitely think of a few of my friends like this that dominate the higher stakes. However, it's still possible to exploit them in almost the same way that we exploit the weaker aggressive reg. Of course, since they're more skilled, our level of exploitation has to be lower to maintain our edge. On 8-7-4 flush draw, I would still check my entire range because it looks more or less okay, but on King 5-4 rainbow, I'd play the following strategy versus a strong aggressive player. You can see that what I'm doing here looks very similar to my strategy before. I'm check raising all of my strongest hands, and I'm getting a decent betting frequency by just betting my top pairs as well as a lot of my strongest draws. I'm actually starting to bluff here a little bit to conceal my strategy, even though a lot of these bluffs are probably losing money in a vacuum. I'm actually playing quite a mixed strategy here out of position because I do expect my opponents to really pick up on obvious imbalances and attack them. I don't want to be way too weak when I check, and I want to have some board coverage to not be too capped on many turn and river runouts versus hyper-aggressive regs. Just like before, I still think the best way to exploit really aggressive players is to just open tighter pre-flop. These sorts of players will often 3-bet very aggressively, especially blind versus blind, which gives you an even bigger reason to tighten up your range pre-flop. My overall level of exploitation versus these players is quite low, both because I expect them to know what to do, and because I expect them to apply the necessary pressure when they see that I'm pretty imbalanced. However, because the level of exploitation is never zero, I'm still always trying to find ways to sneakily get a little bit more EV out of their playstyle. I'm never striving to play Nash just for the sake of playing Nash, but studying Nash here is actually quite helpful in adding resilience to your strategy and making it seem like you're doing everything in line. And that's all there is. We covered a lot in this video, from levels of exploitation to developing unique exploitative strategies versus different player types at different skill levels. This was very content heavy. If you found any of this confusing, especially conceptually, please check out the video in the description. It's the first link there. It takes you to a video which debunks the most common flop betting strategy. It tells you why it's wrong, and it shows you the tools you need to stop losing money pre-flop, or on the flop, and start making a lot of money. And if you like this sort of content, please do consider subscribing. By subscribing, you don't have to wait until the video comes back up in your homepage. Next time you want to see something from me, it's just going to be right there for you. You're even going to be notified when it comes out, and you'll be the first to get it to really exploit your opponents. This is Tri Squared. It's been fun having you guys, and I'll see you in the next one.